really great to have you with us. And
Thank you for inviting me.
there's a strong intellectual continuity with your slavery, the slave trade, and the roots of U.S. imperialism, North Africa, Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, West Africa, and so on, and your earlier work. For example, The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, that argues that slavery, white supremacy, settler colonialism, and capitalism have to be understood together in explaining the emergence of the United States. And this includes, I think, the deepest South, the U.S., Brazil, and the African slave trade, and work like the White Pacific, U.S. imperialism and black slavery, and on and on. Am I correct that, and also one of your more recent works, The Overthrow of Hawaii and the Rise of U.S. Imperialism in the Pacific, am I correct that the connectivity is international in terms of really understanding slavery, capitalism, racism, and how imperialism developed? Is this a kind of continuous theme developed through all of your works?
You are correct. And I should also add more pointedly, you mentioned the book on Brazil and the African slave trade, the United States' role in the African slave trade to Brazil. Brazil, of course, having the largest number of Africans this side of Nigeria. And I argue in that text that one of the major reasons was the manic energy of U.S. slave traders, not least in the 1840s. But in doing that book, what I was able to discover is that as the abolitionist forces placed pressure on U.S. enslavers in West Africa, they simply sailed around the Cape to Mozambique, where the Portuguese dominated and colonized, and particularly to Zanzibar, which is now part of Tanzania. But in the bad old days of the slave trade, it was akin to the Kmart of the African slave trade. You had Africans brought from various corners of the continent to Zanzibar. And as early as the 1840s, U.S. interests were predominant on that island. And to connect this to today's news, you may have noticed that the current U.S. president has threatened to bomb Oman, Oman being a neighbor of Iran in terms of control of the Straits of Hormuz. Mr. Trump is not satisfied with what Oman is doing. Omanis were collaborating with the U.S. interests in the slave trade in the 1840s, helping to transport Africans from Zanzibar around the Cape to Brazil, with some actually trickling into the United States of America. I should also mention, in the context of your noting my book, The White Pacific, U.S. Imperialism and Black Slavery in the South Seas After the Civil War, that that book basically puts forward a major theme of a number of my works, which I would call the Confederate diaspora. That is to say that after the enslavers were defeated in North America in 1865, they did not necessarily fold up their tents and decide to perfect their golf game, so to speak. Many of them migrated to the South Seas, where they began to turn Melanesians and Polynesians into captive labor, not least in Fiji and in Queensland, Australia. And the Hawaiian monarchy, which was a modernizing monarchy, intervened and for its troubles was overthrown by 1893 in a typical white supremacist Republican coup, and then incorporated as the 50th and presumed final state of the United States of America in 1959. You also know that I did a book on Cuba, where I discuss a similar theme. After 1865, many of the U.S. enslavers, they take their Africans from North America into Cuba, just like they take their Africans, some of them, these enslavers, into Brazil. And with regard to the book at hand, the book starts in 1875 when Confederate military men, and to be fair, certain Union military men as well, flock to Cairo, where they collaborate with the rulers in Egypt on an ill-fated, ill-advised invasion of Ethiopia, which was designed to convert Ethiopia as part of a larger so-called Egyptian empire and then turn it into another source for enslaved labor, because Egypt was a major enslaving power even after 1865 and certainly before 1865, with a major target being their southern neighbor, speaking of the Sudan. And I should also mention that if you cross the Red Sea into what is now Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia was also a major recipient of enslaved Africans. In fact, there's evidence to suggest that as late as 1957, Saudi rulers were arriving in Washington, D.C. with enslaved Africans in tow. Interestingly enough, Mecca, one of the holiest sites in Islam, was also in the 19th century a site for trading and purchasing enslaved Africans. In terms of the further themes of this book, uh, Ottoman Turkey, today's Turkey, was also a major force in terms of the slave trade. Ostensibly, Ottoman Turkey was ruling Egypt as part of the Ottoman Empire and Saudi Arabia as well. But Ottoman Turkey was also enslaving Africans, but they were a kind of equal opportunity enslaver. They were enslaving many Slavs, for example. They were enslaving particularly Circassian women who were targeted to be concubines. And in that regard, I should also mention one of the most horrific aspects of this leg of the African slave trade was the creation of eunuchs. That is to say, the Ottoman subjects and leaders, I should say, one of their specialties was castrating African men. One of the purposes was to guard their harems. It was felt that if they were castrated, they did not present any sort of threat to the women in this harem. And overall, the role of the United States is in collaboration with many of these decrepit regimes. You had Mississippi enslavers traveling to the slave markets of Egypt in the 19th century. I mentioned in particular the Nutt family, N-U-T-T. You may recall, if you're a sports fan, that a former football coach of the University of Arkansas Razorback football team was Houston Nutt. He was dismissed a few years ago, although I've suggested that some might want to knock on his door and claim a kind of indirect reparations from him. And with regard to this entire sub-region, which is replete with what you might call deputy sheriffs today for U.S. imperialism, thinking of Saudi Arabia, whose leader, Mohammed bin Salman, is perpetually humiliated by Mr. Trump. Just a few weeks ago, he came to Washington to ink a deal for civilian nuclear power that after he left, presumably satisfied, Mr. Trump pulled the rug out from under him by saying that he had to recognize Israel before that deal was consummated. But you can also see that kind of sellout regime as well in Morocco. Morocco has the audacity to be perhaps the leading sellout regime in terms of this entire book. And insofar as Morocco was complicit not only in collaborating with London in terms of the African slave trade, but you had Moroccan enslavers who were enslaving darker skinned people to the south. You even had segregated mosques in Morocco, believe it or not, which one would have thought was contrary to the norms of Islam. So what I'm suggesting in this book is that in order to understand U.S. imperialism today, particularly its repetitive role in West Asia, particularly these puppet regimes in Cairo and Morocco, in Tunisia, in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, it might be useful to understand some of the backstory, some of this history, particularly as it relates to enslaving of Africans.
I want you to put some of the puzzle pieces now together. You've laid out a good deal. And there's the methodology and the ideology in terms of your scholarship. How does the U.S. and U.S. history operate from a global perspective? You bring that global perspective and how it helps us change our understanding of the country's origins and its role in the world. We're usually very circumspect, very narrow in our understanding. We operate and understand slavery strictly as it functions here, as though there was no development and capital relations in the rest of the world. Your book certainly blows that apart. But go back and put some additional, bring some of those pieces back together again, because it's really quite complex. How the global slave trade, the wealth that it generated, and the struggle to control labor and markets really helped create the conditions for the rise of U.S. imperialism. We have a tendency to think of Great Britain, of Belgium, of France, and so on, but the U.S. is not part of the imperialist endeavor, except for completely modern times. But you draw a very different picture. Continue that process and thread those pieces, or put those pieces of the puzzle together for us even further.
Well, as you and many in your audience already recognize, there has been considerable scholarship on the connection between slavery, the slave trade, the rise of capitalism, and ultimately the rise of imperialism. I'm thinking of the founding father of modern Trinidad and Tobago, Eric Williams, in his book, Capitalism and Slavery, the late Guyanese scholar Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. I'm thinking of the man, as far as I know, is still in the land of the living, Joseph Inekori, of Nigerian extraction, but now in Rochester, New York, who's written voluminously on the Industrial Revolution in England and its connection to slavery. And most recently, we have this 1,300-page doorstop from Sven Beckert of Harvard, Capitalism, A Global History. And to his credit, he does not throw up a wall between slavery and capitalism, and ultimately does not throw up a wall between slavery on the one hand and capitalism and imperialism on the other hand. He, like a number of contemporary scholars, sees the ability to hire, if you like, or to deploy more precisely, an unpaid sector of the working class has been essential to the rise of capitalism and imperialism. And then after the abolition, or the ostensible abolition of slavery, I should say, you see other forms of coerced labor arise, including convict labor, for example, which you had in profusion in Texas. You may know about the city of Sugar Land, Texas, which is a suburb of Houston. And only in recent years have the cadavers, the bones of Black men been dug up who were convict laborers on sugar plantations. So this question of unpaid labor continues to this very day, when we see this euphemism of wage theft, for example, which is basically a euphemism for not paying workers what they're due. And you may have seen the article in the New York Times in late 2025 about Saudi Arabia and the exploitation of women across the Red Sea, particularly from Kenya, who are subject to massive wage theft, which you can see in a de facto sense as a form of neo-slavery. So capitalism, as it developed in the United States, was heavily dependent, as any school child can tell you, on the unpaid labor, not only of Africans, but early on, there was a slave trade involving the indigenous population as well. That is to say, today, if you were to do an investigation, you could find the DNA of indigenous North Americans in the Caribbean, in the Turkish slave markets, for example. And this helps to explain this so far spectacular economic development of the United States of America. I recall that when you had this Copernican change of regimes in Eastern Europe, as the socialist count was overthrown, I wanted to remind many in Poland and Hungary and Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Soviet Union, etc., Russia, etc., that if they wanted to mirror the spectacular economic development of the United States of America, they might want to find an enslaved labor force that they could rely upon for centuries, for example. But the good news is that that model of development that has led the United States into the front rank of nations is being challenged systematically and systemically globally. You see it most recently in terms of this humiliation that U.S. imperialism is suffering in Iran as we speak. You see it with regard to the rise of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And so the challenge for many of us in the United States will be to develop a model of economic orientation that is not as heavily dependent upon wage theft, upon indentured labor, upon mass enslavement, etc.
You know, one of the things that really hits me about your book, and I think it's most significant, that plantation slavery it produces profits, but your larger argument seems to be that we cannot separate the rise of the United States from slavery, the slave trade, capitalism, settler colonialism, racial hierarchy, and international competition among empires. And I have to say that one of the things that I found particularly fascinating in your book, and I haven't, in all honesty, been able to read it thoroughly, but I will with great deliberacy because it takes a good deal of thinking to internalize all that's in there. Brilliant, important book. But, you know, one of the things that particularly hit me there was that you seem to indicate that as you looked at the U.S. Civil War, former Confederates actually went to, and you referenced this a bit earlier, went to Egypt, and that by the 1870s, Americans were involved in military ventures reaching towards Ethiopia. From there, the investigation that you undertook necessarily expanded to Egypt and Ethiopia and Sudan and Eritrea, etc. Talk more about this. This is quite amazing because we have this wonderful mythology that there's the abolition of slavery, and that ends it. That ends it. Granted, we may be left with a situation of plantation capitalism, but hey, that's got nothing to do with the evolution of imperialism and the direct thread there. But I just thought that was incredible, right? Former Confederates went to Egypt.
And as noted to Brazil as well, where slavery was not abolished until 1888, and shortly before that, you had the abolition of slavery in Cuba, with U.S. nationals on the wrong side of the barricades. But the position of these enslavers in the United States of America was that slavery was just too insanely profitable to give up. With regard to the slave trade, for centuries, you could invest $1 and have $1,700 coming back into your pocket. There are those who would sell their firstborn for such a spectacular profit, not to mention some African they did not know. And so the idea post 1865 was to somehow continue enslavement. Certainly it continued in Zanzibar, where you had a sizable number of U.S. nationals flocking there after 1865. And as noted, many of them flocking to Cairo, where they planned to reinvigorate a long-term dream of Cairo which is to establish a kind of empire heading south towards the equator, but they were defeated. As a matter of fact, in the context of this book, even though it deals mostly with the U.S. period, and I should mention parenthetically a subject that perhaps we should tackle at some point, which is how Euro-Americans, after they lost the protective umbrella of London with the overthrow of British rule, they became subject to becoming captive labor in Algiers in particular. That is a story that in many ways begins this book. But to return to the thread, and the thread being resistance, not only in Ethiopia, but I draw a continuum in terms of the weakening and ultimate destabilization of slavery, going back to the 9th century in what is now Iraq, with the so-called Zanj revolt, Z-A-N-J, as we discuss it in the English language, which lasted for more than a decade in terms of enslaved Africans fighting their oppressors. Then, of course, something this audience is intimately familiar with, the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, which has profoundly significant impact upon 19th century slavery and helping to create a general crisis of the entire slave system that could only be resolved with its collapse. You see Haitian diplomats collaborating with civil society in Europe, particularly London, to put pressure on this trans-Saharan and Red Sea slave trade. And then there is the 1896 defeat of the Italian invaders by the Ethiopians, or the Abyssinians, as they were then called, which was of like profound significance because, as noted, slavery was so insanely profitable that you had to defeat it arms in hand. You had to defeat it on the battlefield in order for it to shrink. And I should mention in this context the role of Russia, because as noted, Ottoman Turkey was an equal opportunity enslaver, not only enslaving Africans, but Europeans, and they particularly targeted, as noted, Southeastern Europeans and Russians too. And so as early as 200 years ago, you saw the Russian regime executing slave dealers at a time when the so-called Revolutionary Republic in North America was coddling same. By the time of the Italian invasion of Abyssinia, Ethiopia in the 1890s, one of the many reasons that the Abyssinians were able to defeat the invaders was because they were armed to the teeth by Russia. And of course, that particular pattern continued post-1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution. And in other words, just as the Haitian Revolution created a fatal breach in the system of enslavement, the ability of Ethiopia to remain sovereign and therefore to engage in bilateral deals with other sovereign nations was ultimately weakening for the system of colonialism and ultimately weakening for the system of slavery. And that's this is a book that's full of contradiction. I mean, for example,
well, we're going to ask you to hold it there, and we're going to bring up, for example, in a moment. But you've been listening to Dr. Gerald Horne discussing his new book, Slavery, the Slave Trade and the Roots of U.S. Imperialism, and tracing how slavery and the trade in human beings became deeply intertwined with the accumulation of wealth and the rise of U.S. power. And we'll continue this important conversation in part two of Building Bridges. And right now, let's just hear a wonderful piece by Joseph Kabasela, La Grande Kaba, Independence, from Congo, Independence, Cha-Cha. Congo. That was from the 1960s, actually, that extraordinary piece by Joseph Kabasela, Independence, Cha-Cha. This is Building Bridges. I'm Mimi Rosenberg, and we're bringing you part two of our conversation with historian Dr. Gerald Horne about his new book, Slavery, the Slave Trade, and the Roots of U.S. Imperialism. And we want to continue following the historic connections between enslavement, capitalist accumulation, territorial expansion, and the emergence of the United States as an imperial power, and what that history tells us about the world we inhabit today. If you can pick up your threads from our last segment, Dr. Horne, where I just wanted to break for that wonderful musical interlude and give us a chance to reintroduce you.
Well, as I was saying, I think that these breaches in the system of exploitation, be it the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, or Ethiopia's ability to preserve sovereignty in the face of threats of having colonialism imposed, was very significant. We've already referenced how the Haitian Revolution ultimately destabilized slavery in this hemisphere. And it's not accidental that when Nelson Mandela was a younger man and was seeking arms and aid on a largely colonized African continent, he was able to travel to Addis Ababa for Sukar, if not more. But once again, this is a story of contradiction. I've already mentioned how Egypt was ostensibly a province of Ottoman Turkey, but it had empire ambitions all of its own, heading south towards the equator. It really pummeled its neighbor Sudan. And in fact, you may recall that by the early 1880s, Egypt in some ways switched its colonial patron from Ottoman Turkey to London. And then in the following decade, there was the notorious Anglo-Egyptian condominium that controlled Sudan up until independence in 1956. In other words, Egypt was both fish and fowl. It was, on the one hand, a kind of colonial appendage, and on the other hand, a would-be colonial exploiter all of its own, in which well prepares Cairo for its contemporary role as a sort of deputy sheriff for U.S. imperialism. And likewise, with regard to Ethiopia, on the one hand, it was fighting against colonialism and fighting against enslavement, but it tolerated enslavement internally. I should also mention that this book has some interesting nuggets for those interested in the history of Zionism, for example, because I noted a few moments ago that the United States, after it escaped the reigns of London, it had its nationals, Euro-Americans, being subjected to being captive laborers in Algiers in particular, which had been a kind of fate and destiny for Europeans stretching back centuries. But what happens is that the United States was able to mobilize against the so-called Barbary pirates. You may recall the Marine hymn from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, because this idea of turning Euro-Americans into captive labor was not solely the province of Algiers. And what they wound up doing was softening up Algiers to the point where it was colonized by France circa 1830, which lasted until the early 1960s, where Algeria was able to escape French colonial rule and become an independent power. The way Zionism comes into the picture is that even though it goes against the kind of schematic that many oftentimes apply when they talk about the United States, seeing it as a step forward from the deviltry of Europe, you had very deep and profound anti-Jewish fervor in the United States of America, anti-Semitism as it is called. And this was accelerated once the United States came into conflict with Algiers, because the accusation was made that the rulers in Algiers were in league with Jewish elites in North Africa as well. And that helps to accelerate a pre-existing anti-Jewish fervor in the United States of America. And I trace that particular thread throughout the book to the point where I note that even though the propaganda suggests that when Israel was formed in 1947, 1948, that it was a kind of neo-socialist enterprise. But if you look at the history of David Ben-Gurion, who is still celebrated as a founding father in Israel, when he first lands in historic Palestine, one of his major points that he was advocating and promulgating was that Jewish entrepreneurs should only hire Jewish workers. Now, that's a strange kind of socialist. It's a kind of, pardon the expression, a kind of national socialism, if you like. And certainly, I think that those who are concerned, as well they should be, by the present crisis in historic Palestine, will walk away from this book, I would hope, better informed.
Yeah, and certainly I did. And you raise another issue for me now, and I'm interested in elaborating on what role did slavery and anti-Black racism play in motivating former Confederates to participate in Egyptian expansion into Ethiopia. We really haven't talked about that aspect of things.
Well, anti-Blackness is at the heart of what I'm talking about in this book. Those who follow the news may be familiar with the fact that the comic actor Kevin Hart was barred from Egypt because he was said to have represented and presented what might be called Afrocentric points of view, which actually goes back to Nubian leadership in what is now Egypt centuries ago. Likewise, Jada Pinkett Smith, the actor and producer, came under fire in Egypt because of a film that she was producing that portrayed Cleopatra as being melanin rich, for example. Even though understandably we associate anti-Blackness with the Europeans and with Western Europe, particularly the Euro-Americans who had made it their calling card, let us to say the Euro-American elites, and it's trickled down, I'm afraid to say, to subaltern classes. But there are historians, and I'll just present their thesis without necessarily signing on to it. There are historians who suggest that just as the development of Western Europe some centuries ago was heavily dependent upon what was being learned from the Arab world. For example, we use Arab numerals to this very day. They have suggested that another import was anti-Blackness. And certainly, even though it would be probably a bridge too far to suggest that anti-Blackness is as deeply entrenched in the areas I'm discussing as it is in North America, it would be equally fallacious to dismiss it as a factor. I mean, after doing this research and writing this book, I think I came to understand why when the Nation of Islam developed some decades ago in the U.S. Midwest, that it did not necessarily follow the norms, many of the norms, I should say, that were then prevalent in the Arab world and in North Africa in particular, that it evolved as a kind of Black nationalist formation, which in many ways is a reaction to the anti-Blackness, not only in the United States, but to a certain extent as it persisted in North Africa and West Asia as well.
You know, one of the things that was fascinating to me and calling out and how you unearth these marvelous, these incredibly pointed gems of information. The Confederate officers, such as W. Loring and H. Sibley and Samuel Lockett and Raleigh Colston, they chose to serve in Egypt. I mean, there's this. We have to understand somehow this relationship between the defeat of the Confederacy in 1865 and the continuation of Confederate ideas overseas. I mean, there was this kind of diaspora that nurtured these these individuals. And you very much argue that exploitation per se certainly did not perish at Appomattox. So I wonder if you can just delve into that a little bit more and to find these folks like and tell us a little bit more about who they were, Loring and Sibley and so on, who, wow, they chose to serve in Egypt.
Well, they found Egypt and Cairo and Alexandria in particular quite congenial. As a matter of fact, a number of them commented upon the parallels that they saw between Egypt and the slave South, between Egypt and Dixie. They were, on the one hand, quite comforted by the idea that Egypt throughout the 19th century was plundering neighboring Sudan for enslaved Africans. But per the reference to the Ottomans, they were quite disturbed by the intermittent presence in Cairo and in Alexandria of melanin deficient women in particular, which went against their particular norms. I should also say that this book also makes an implicit critique of the Black leadership of that era, and I think it could be extended to this very day. What I mean is that a good deal of the Frederick Douglass-led leadership seemed to be oblivious to the reality that those who had oppressed and exploited us were going overseas for momentum. That is to say, seeking to revivify slavery, which ultimately could be revived on these shores. I guess you could make an argument, if you would like to excuse them, for the fact that their hands were full of fighting the Ku Klux Klan and the racist terrorists, for example. But that sort of neglect of global developments is still part and parcel of a good deal of the Black leadership today, for example. How many have had a mumbling word to say about the rise of China, which is one of the most monumental developments of this century? How many of them have had a word to say about the national humiliation the United States is undergoing in Iran? Even though, just as in the 19th century, our tax dollars from our brow and from our sweat and tears is going to finance these sorts of enterprises that are ultimately to our detriment. Now, we know, of course, that this is not accidental with regard to the contemporary leadership. That is to say, we know that in return for anti-Jim Crow concessions approximately 70, 75 odd years ago, the internationals amongst us, led by the late, great Paul Robeson, were tossed overboard. And even though that deal was made in the context of a Cold War where the Soviet Union was seen as a threat, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. But like the beard that continues to grow on the face of a cadaver, this deal, at least as far as a good deal of the Black leadership is concerned, continues to hang on. Even though the rationale for the deal has long since disappeared, which is not only jeopardizing us as a people, but in many ways, it's helping to contribute to an ultimate destabilizing crisis, economic crisis, propelled by $40 trillion in debt to begin with. And so, once again, I think And I hope that those who look at this book for more than a nanosecond will walk away with information that will steel them for future and further battles.
You know, some of the things, so much there, read it carefully, parse it out, digest it. One of the questions I want to ask, you've touched on it somewhat, but why do you think slavery continued well into the 20th century in places such as Persia and Bahrain and Kuwait and Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Yemen, despite the growing international abolitionist movement? Because there was an abolitionist movement at the same time these things were developing.
Well, to begin with and to reiterate, it's insanely profitable to have one working in your enterprise, be it a plantation or be it a shop that is not paid. And then that is propelled by anti-blackness, which helps to rationalize and justify that kind of exploitation. And then with regard to the United States, which is a rising power at the end of the 19th century and well into the 20th century, it was oftentimes led by men who found anti-blackness quite congenial. I'm thinking of Woodrow Wilson, for example, who was propelled into the White House after being governor of New Jersey, but actually had deep roots in Dixie, for example. And after he comes into office in Washington, approximately 110 years ago, he begins to impose a rather suffocating and asphyxiating Jim Crow, ousting many black people from positions they had held previously. And Woodrow Wilson and many of the leaders of the Democratic Party, which at that time was a party of Dixie, a party of Mississippi, a party of Louisiana, a party of Georgia, many of these leaders were unreconciled to the idea of abolition and emancipation, because after all, many of them or their families lost fortunes. I'm working on another project, and I was looking at the memoirs of a man by the name of Thomas Watson Brown, who, by the way, before he passed away, was a major investor in the Atlanta Falcons football team, and of course, a resident of Atlanta. And he was still complaining late into the 20th century about how slave property was taken from his ancestors without compensation, for example. And I should mention parenthetically that one of his ancestors, Thomas Watson, was a senator from the Peach State, from the state of Georgia, and he was propelled into prominence when he led the campaign to lynch the Jewish man from Brooklyn, speaking of Leo Frank, who was lynched in Georgia circa 1915 after an accusation that he had sexually molested a young Christian woman in his employ, for example. So these are all the threads that are interconnected that I think if we are to make progress, we're going to have to unravel these threads in order to create a new day and a new horizon.
Well, there's so much more that I want to parse out. I wanted to talk about the creation of Israel in 1948 and how it altered, or did it alter, the political relationship between the U.S., Egypt, and broader Middle East. But you're going to have to read the book to find out more about those things. But in the time that we have left, you connect the decline of slavery with the rise of socialism and anti-colonial movements. How did these movements challenge older systems of racial and economic exploitation?
Well, we have to cling to the concept I introduced, I believe, a few moments ago, of slaves being, amongst other matters, the unpaid sector of the working class. And so therefore, when you have the overthrow of slavery in Haiti in particular, and their influence begins to spread throughout the hemisphere, contributing ultimately to the U.S. Civil War. It's no accident, as historians like to say, that post-U.S. Civil War, you see the rise of unions, you see the rise of the 8-hour day, because an enslaved working force serves as a drag on the wages and working conditions of the paid labor force. I think it's also fair to take that a step forward to suggest that the abolition of slavery leads to a deeper understanding of the relatively modern concept of human rights, a term we toss around quite casually, although it's a recent, in historical terms, vintage. And so I think that what this should lead us to understand is that as we move forward in this country against Trumpism, against neo-fascism, a part of our arsenal should not be an attention to those subjected to wage theft. It should not be an attention to those at the lowest rung of the socioeconomic ladder, because to the extent that those sectors continue to persist, it only encourages those at the top of the socioeconomic pyramid. And in order to ensure that their lush profits continue to flow, they have demonstrated in many countries over the decades that they are not above resorting to slavery. They're not above resorting to its close cousins, speaking of fascism, for example. So I think that these are amongst the many lessons that I would hope emerge from these pages.
And a coda to this book, because honestly, I didn't get the book in time to completely finish it. I am deeply engrossed, and I'm trying to take a chapter a night because it's so rich in information and scholarship, and it really does something that for me is critical, but I'm wondering what the final lesson is for you. And for me, the evolution of U.S. imperialism and how it continued to develop in an international context post the elimination of slavery, or slavery transformed into plantation capitalism, into wage slavery in this country. And that's a lot of what I learned. And the financial interactions, and I was thinking about that as I took the bus today past Barclays Center, which in Brooklyn has become a major gathering place for people to demonstrate or to launch their demonstrations from. And it's certainly the home of the Nets, the Brooklyn Nets, and various other show events. But for goodness sakes, to be named after Barclays Bank, we weren't able to disturb that. So take us to your final thoughts about what you want to show from this book. And if you have anything nasty to say, rightfully so, about how the hell we still converge under something called Barclays Bank.
Well, once again, I think that those who are serious about building and constructing a new world and a new society, a world where exploitation, labor exploitation in particular, is in its death throes, that we ultimately have to understand that we have to overthrow the vestiges of these barnacles that continue to cling tenaciously to the current day society. And that includes, for example, anti-Blackness, but it also includes the question of gender exploitation. For example, as noted, the trans-Saharan slave trade and the slave trade from involving Circassians and involving Southeastern Europeans in particular, targeted women in particular. And so we should also, I think, try to develop a better and deeper understanding of the United States of America. What I was suggesting a moment or two ago was that there's a sort of schematic that's oftentimes employed, I think, naively, when there is a comparison of the United States of America with the Western European nations, for example. And if you look at Napoleon, for example, many in our audience are familiar with the fact that he tried to return slavery to Haiti, for example, and to a certain extent was successful in returning it to Martinique and Guadeloupe, for example. But at the same time, when his forces were sweeping through what is now Italy and what is now Germany, he was oftentimes knocking down the walls of the Jewish ghettos, for example. So what I'm trying to illustrate with that point is that we have to move away from a sort of schematic and assuming that we're all on the same page, that our interests are always dovetailing even amongst those who are subject to exploitation. I mentioned Russia, for example, which under the Tsar was the home of pogroms. That is to say, looting and plundering and pillaging the Jewish populations, but at the same time, as noted, the Tsar, for religious reasons, because the leaders in Abyssinia and Addis Ababa were Christian, oftentimes came to the defense in the face of what were perceived to be threats from Islamic forces, not least from Egypt, and not least from across the Red Sea in Saudi Arabia. So I guess what I'm saying is that there's a lot of work in terms of reading, and there's a lot of work in terms of writing that needs to be done as we begin to try to dig ourselves out of this deep hole in which we find ourselves.
Well, you've been listening to Dr. Gerald Horne, historian and author of Slavery, the Slave Trade, and the Roots of U.S. Imperialism, a sweeping examination of how the exploitation of enslaved people and the wealth produced through the slave trade helped lay foundations for the growth of U.S. capitalism and empire. And for God's sakes, let's change the name of the Barclays Center now and forever. We've got a lot of mountains to climb before we sleep. This has been Building Bridges. I'm Mimi Rosenberg. I want to thank you for listening, and do keep building bridges. And special thanks to Dr. Horne. And we're almost about to have him back with his next book, but we'll keep that as a surprise until we do. Dr. Horne, thank you so much for all that you do.
Thank you for inviting me.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.